Rise of the Eco Guards. Stand on guard with me. The Call to Serve Canada. Part 2, Section I. Playing around with plastics reclamations. Hello, and welcome back to the Rise of the Eco Guards. Stand on guard with me series of works entitled The Call to Serve Canada. This video series is brought to you by Gemco, Incorporated, 1990, the parent entity responsible for its other not-for-profit divisions, encompassing those known as the Eco Guards organizations, which all include Eco Guards, IES, an acronym which stands for Innovative Eco Solutions, Gemco Deep, with its other acronym known as Digital Eco Educational Productions, and Eco Tech Arts, as well as the Young Eco Rangers, as we proceed with the blessing of Asgardian Ministries. With our educational, informative, investigative, conceptual, artistic, well-thought-out designs and deterministic videos in this 10-part series. In the last video sequences of The Call to Serve Canada Part 2, Section H, I expressed many of the things that I had begun to achieve after attaining my better education, as I was also working on attaining my degree in microcomputer electronics engineering and computer sciences. I never got into the expressions in that last video of why I sought to study in those lifelong fields of ever-increasing sciences and disciplines that I was conducting in 1985, other than to learn, explore, and put into practical use the many different types of future energy systems that I was trying to build and test. For I do believe that humanity needs a better manner of harnessing energy, for we'll require much of that in order to truly deal with all the waste being generated by humanity. But we'll also need greater and greater amounts to help feed all the peoples of the world, as well as proving and showing all the future technologies. And that's whether or not the human population increases or declines. For currently there are computer models showing both possibilities of population decline and increases. And you should already know what I think about computer modeling or algorithmic predictive extrapolations if you've been following my previous videos. That said, at one time during those early years of my studies, I would delve into areas that I truly believed that computers would be used in our future for, mostly as educational tools and assistants in pulling together vast amounts of quickly accessible knowledges. And that was before Google and YouTube existed. But that is why I would greatly and enthusiastically support and promote those platforms for all those decades. But also as communications devices that would also allow humanity to get past many of the language barriers that we would need to have in order to find a great many solutions that could help guide humanity into a brighter, ecologically sound future, while still allowing all of us to gain greater technological advancements, thereby increasing our knowledge, but also helping us all in creating better manners of conducting our ways of life and assisting in the management of many areas, like in our food productions and delivery systems and the pure focused manners of reducing food waste. For many corporate leaders would sooner bury all food that does not sell than to have it dehydrated and then ship it all throughout the world to feed those starving children and great many peoples. Now, with that said, even the dehydration of that food will require vast amounts of energy, but also in the management of vast quantities of waste plastics, petroleum products, and so much more. For I had also envisioned and theorized that someday these future computer systems would also assist people to directly communicate in their own language with others of a different language and quickly conversing back and forth, while also doing this through vast distances by way of video-type communications, but also in a better manner of creating a future type of voting system like I had written about in that last novel of the Eco Guards 3Es, with integrated facial recognition, fingerprint recognition scanners, iris recognition scanners, all linked to your photo ID or driver's licenses. A truly different and more secure voting apparatus with its multi-layered, secure, and encrypted, but also dedicated democratic system, which is also able to get an accurate factual vote count almost instantaneously that is made by the people and for the people. Anyways, I'm getting off topic and jumping ahead here, for that's supposed to be in the next section of this series. As previously mentioned in 1986, as I was immersing myself in what I was studying as it relates to microcomputer electronics engineering and computer sciences, and I had also completed the last of the Eco Guards novel series. I sought to find a publisher for these three novellas and began to send out single copies of these works out to a great many publishers in Canada, the United States, and even in Great Britain. Over some time, all I would get back were a great many rejection letters, and in some cases, they actually returned those copies. But not in all cases. And those actions and facts made me wonder what they were doing with them. But I would also learn many decades later that sometimes publishers do this and bank or store those types of unsolicited literary artistic works and sell them to other production companies, so that later in time, they can rip those apart for ideas for some of their new productions. But that many politicians and elitists also conduct those types of actions in order to farm information. Apparently, it's even more common nowadays with the advent of faster, more complex computers, software applications, and the Internet of Things, which also now includes info mining from personal cell phones, and believe it or not, even the cloud-based storages that many companies claim is safe and secure, which are not. For if anything happens to you in life and you pass away, that becomes their property. Check into it and learn those truths. And I know, because I used to work for two of the largest wireless and internet companies in Canada. And there's so much the public does not know. Anyways, that's pretty well common knowledge now. Let's get back to where I was at. For during that time frame, the 1980s, I also began to explore the possibility of actually creating the real Eco-Guardians movement. What I then believed should be a group of like-minded peoples with different backgrounds that could take on some of the ecological injustices that seem to be transpiring in our local area. For groups like Greenpeace were consumed with overall global environmental affairs, and that was a good thing back then, but few groups were focused on local environmental affairs. And eventually in late 1986, I began to seek out the assistance of a group of people whom I believe could help achieve those goals. And in early 1987, 6 of us came together and founded the first Eco Guards organization, and would go on to create some very interesting futuristic manners of conducting our own affairs. That said, the other 5 individuals were also quite busy with their lives and their other goals, for at least 3 were also involved with other well-established not-for-profit endeavors, and could not devote as much time as they would have liked to this new group of Eco Guards. Nevertheless, they all voted and chose me as their primary Eco Guards leader, and I would be tasked with not only speaking on their behalf, but also expressing some of our goals and eco-based solutions to the public, but also with creating many of our conceptual designs as it relates towards a great many innovative eco-based solutions, and even some that were not really based around ecological principles, but around human safety in a great many fields, such as fire warning and suppression systems. As previously mentioned in the past videos entitled The Call to Serve Canada, Part 2, Section B, Altered Attributes, and Section C, Hopes in Our Home Sweet Homes, I would describe some of my very early ecologically minded actions in collecting samples and some of the labels from some of the toxic elements being disposed of at that riverside dump, as well as some of the public events that I was involved with in an effort to have those Petit Kodiak Riverside City dumps permanently shut down. For we believe that the toxic elements and particle plastics that were spewing from the compression of that trash were finding their ways into that river system and then flowing into the Fundy Basin, thereby affecting the life forms all along the riverbanks that relied upon those ecosystems, but also the fish and shellfish stocks found and also harvested in the Fundy Bay for human consumptions. So in an effort to bring great attention to our plights without a destructive or confrontational set of traits like other groups of environmentalists were doing, we opted to try something different, while also devising a manner of creating a warning to humanity, by showing them the possible future scenario where humanity would need protective percussion armors or suits of this type just to venture outside if we kept disrespecting and polluting our environment en masse. truly never realizing what that would really accomplish, but also realizing that these types of costume character actions were not commonplace back then, like they are nowadays. Nevertheless, after some conversations with the other eco guards, I began these efforts by focusing on creating two prototype repurposed plastic and Kevlar armored suits that would be used during public events to help promote and distinguish ourselves, as well as promoting our goals. By bringing attention to those, we hope that the general public would join with us in calling upon our local and provincial politicians to stand up and stop these as well as many other destructive actions. And in 1987 and 1988, the birth of Eco Prime, also known as Captain Patriot, would be realized. It would take years of doing such and a great many conversations, including those with some of our newer members and supporters, whom we had apparently convinced to join with us, while also devising a different series of eco-based solutions within our think tank efforts that could be used as alternatives to burying that garbage into the ground and covering that trash with topsoils, which also included a manner of reclaiming the petroleum or tar from all the roofing shingles that were just being buried in the ground at our local riverside dumps. Our testing, analyses, and determinations also revealed that we could place those within very large tanks with hot water, and cooking goes off, and also reclaiming the other materials for use on paths and side roads throughout the city. For that remaining material would mostly be comprised of a lightly tar-covered aggregate with a pulp or fiberglass mixture. When cooled, it would solidify into a thick, spongy, excellent surface material for bike, walking, and other paths, but would also allow for the skimming of vast amounts of rejuvenated tars from those very hot waters prior to extracting those more solid materials, which could be recast into cylindrical cardboard tubes, like those used for industrial roofing, and then reused again for such projects. That said, this process again would require great sums of energy, and that's also another reason that I was constantly looking into creating that new technology. For all forms of recycling are going to require that, and it does not make for a proper economic or efficient manner of conducting those affairs unless that type of power source is possible. And after years of great studies, testing, analysis, determinations, and considerations, I know these devices are possible, and it has been for many years. It's just been suppressed for this long. What's currently interesting is that same process of reducing those tar-based shingles that the Eco Guards came up with in 1987 is now also being used, but with added chemicals, to reduce plastics into oil-based products. And many companies throughout the world, including right here in Canada, have apparently spent billions of dollars to come up with that process, but only as it relates to plastics reclamations. I wonder where they got that idea from, for we've been talking to a great many people and companies about ours for well over 3 decades by now. Can you imagine that? That said, it's now also common knowledge that a great many municipal organizations throughout North America have also currently started to use old roofing shingles in almost the same manner as we once proposed to our governments. And to be factual, all seemed to be moving along quite well back then, until many government officials began to comprehend the true cost of doing such. For it was far more expensive than even we wanted to admit without that energy source and supply. And it was also a lot more difficult to find organizations that would come on board with our recycling efforts. For at that time, it was almost unheard of in North America for many companies to be using reclaimed materials in the manufacturing of their products. Besides the fact that greater and greater numbers of manufacturers were all moving out of our North American countries around that time. Nevertheless, it was beginning to be more of a possibility, but mostly in certain Asian countries like China, India, and several more. For they were buying vast amounts of used plastic clothing that could be bundled and sent by great shipments to their countries for reclamations. Actually quite similar to metal recycling, but with plastic, vinyl, and nylon. And to be factually clear about this, we did consider setting up a facility to attempt this type of endeavor in 1989, but we could not find the extent of support that we would require. And what's meant by that is this, from human labor to the financial aspects, to the proper type of building that would allow for easy transport, would be needed. Nevertheless, Eventually, the provincial government began to consider the implications of having any landfill or garbage dumps near to any major water bodies or sources of great waters. And in 1990 and 91, they eventually worked with the many cities to close down and retire all city and rural dumps. But their solutions that they wanted to continue with were not much better than those past ones. But those consolidated, newer, larger facilities were kept away from those larger bodies of water. But they were still landfills, just managed in a different manner. Eventually, some companies in our local area began and continued to recycle some used and discarded products, such as vast amounts of cardboard, newspapers, and even plastic grocery bags and plastic beverage bottles. But they would not pay much for those materials. And later on, one not-for-profit organization took on the very thing we had conceptually thought of doing years earlier, namely, Moncton Head Start, for they created their own recycling division. Although they seemed to be slightly deceiving the public with the manner that they were promoting their efforts, for they publicly claimed that the clothing being given by the public was being reused by the people for the people in our community, when in fact they were sorting most by grade and type of plastics, but not all of that clothing they were receiving was staying here. Although some of the better clothing was remaining in our community, the remaining greater amounts were headed somewhere else, for they were bundling those into great compressed bales and shipping it to China. In other words, they were reusing some slight amounts of that clothing for the local public, but the greater amount was being packaged and sent away for real recycling and financial gain for those not-for-profit organizations, and certainly not sent to larger Canadian cities for reuse. But they also attained government funding for their efforts and also had access to correctional services, whom brought prisoners, and also worked with the local John Howard Society halfway house in order to help those ex-convicts that wanted to work and get paid, which in my opinion was a win-win, at least in many ways. For restorative justice is a great endeavor that comes in many forms. And I know this with certainty, for one of the people, or should I say clients, that we had helped years earlier at Christian Home Centers, Mr. Roy Shepard, eventually gained the position as manager of that Moncton Head Start Recycles clothing depot when it was at 210 John Street, at the old Canadian Forces Base Military Supply Depot in Moncton. And he just so happened to have heard about that possibility of plastics recycling years earlier. Wonder where they got that conceptual design and idea from. That said, I did speak to him about their efforts in the 1990s, and then they should just tell the truth of those matters to the public, for they would have been surprised with their response, instead of deceitfully conducting those actions. For people don't like being lied to, even about the simple stuff, and that's how conspiracy theories begin. But there was actually a real conspiracy taking place right in front of many people's eyes and noses as it relates to that organization. And if the government would have known, it's possible that several not-for-profits with charity statuses would have been completely shut down. For you can't use one independent organization to completely benefit the other while lying to the government that you're getting those funds from to benefit the one applying, but actually use for the other. Not that they are around now anyways, but I'm sure it's not because of that reason, and I'll mention why coming up towards the end of this video. And the reason I know this with certainty is because the Eco Guards just about got trapped within one of those organizations when it was shown in our local newspaper that the organization in question was going to be closing their doors, for they could not get enough volunteers to help out in doing that extensive type of work in repairing, cleaning, and truly revitalizing those publicly given plastic toys. One of the early Eco Guards organizations, known as Ego's Toys Initiative, that we were willing to bring to bear within that other failing not-for-profit organization that was working towards those same types of goals, gave a great many repurposed, cleaned, revitalized, and repaired toys to many of these other not-for-profit organizations from 1989 to 1997, in order to help them during the Christmas season, but also within other important seasons and times that affects young parents' lives and the many parents that require that type of help to assist them with their children, whether that be Easter or even early children's birthdays, while effectively working at maintaining a sense of keeping these types of artistic-based plastics from ending up in our landfills, as we also continued to effectively promote the true balanced approach to our ecology, economy, and the other educational attributes that are necessary to maintain our society. Although our endeavors were primarily not seen by many in the public as very large, the fact remains that we were the largest non-funded, not-for-profit organization in the Greater Moncton area that was efficiently conducting those types of affairs. With an overall yearly volunteer base of over 47 individuals, with a great many more people whom wanted to volunteer and serve. However, due to the fact that we did not have a large facility and very limited space, and because we were observing fire codes, we could not accommodate many more. With our volunteers having a great many different fields of studies under their belts and many other skill sets, which helped in conducting those endeavors. Those that benefited from our efforts were organizations such as the Pregnancy Crisis Center, and after our observed comments to them, later known as the Pregnancy Wellness Center. The Moncton chapter of the Salvation Army Family Services Division, also Moncton Head Start, Early Childhood Development's Christmas Toyland, Christian Home Centers, the Caring Kitchen, and several others, as well as many parents that we served on our own. After years of conducting those efforts and careful contemplations, as well as those other organizations beginning to be more interested in corporate financial donations and new toys, we would then begin to transition to another field of recycling. Those future efforts will be later described in the upcoming and final video of this series. Anyways, back to where I was at before stating these facts. With our limited failures and successes over those last 10 years leading up to 1997 behind us, as we also continued with far more than just dealing with the repurposing of all those toys, and we were more impressive than anyone would give us credit for, considering we were not funded by anyone except our own Eco Guards members. And we were doing all of this from several of the Eco Guard members' personal homes, or should I say basements and garages. For by that time, our 100 Cornhill Street location was no longer available. But at that place, we worked for several years to help have those Petticodiac Riverside dumps eventually permanently closed down, and also caused a better scrutinizing of the Westinghouse facilities right in our backyards and the toxic elements that would later be cleaned up. Now, back to when we did attain the permission from that manager to step in to the roles of their new leaders for what we believed was a worthwhile cause. And right when we were in the middle of having a great project take form that could have affected the lives of a great many other children in this world, we found out something of negative connotations, mostly what I just mentioned prior, as it relates to one organization applying and gaining government grants and funds while using those funds for a different organization. For we were in talks with our Canadian military as we sought their assistance. And after about a month of converse, great planning, and many actions, we were almost prepared to work with our Canadian forces to have them take a great aircraft cargo lift of plush toys to areas of the world where they were conducting their other duties anyways, and sharing those with the many children in those locations who would truly love to get any of those clean and revitalized plush toys. For the children in our community, according to many others that were working at those many other organizations, that we were supplying with those truly externally and internally cleaned, repaired, and repackaged plastic toys over those past years, had previously also indicated that there seemed to be no local calls for those plush toys from the parents that were being helped with their Christmas and other needs. But after learning something that just about broke many of the lead Eco Guards' hearts, we began to question our participation with that other not-for-profit organization, as well as any of our further actions. Anyways, we almost joined forces that would bring us into taking the lead, for what we prior believed at that time would be a good thing in several ways, but primarily as it was meant to help unfortunate children and all those parents that just wanted to make their children's Christmases even brighter, considering times were hard back then. For we were just coming out of a great recession. It's a good thing that I'm more observant and quick to listen than most people are. Suffice it to say, when I found out the complete truth, we walked away very disappointed with all those other people that were involved within those other limited or remaining organizational structures. And really, I could almost not believe it. For we had been doing these same types of plastic reclamations and toy repairs for about 8 years by then, and we were not funded by anyone other than our members. But eventually we needed to stop, mostly because the other organizations we were giving these toys to started to get fussy and wanted newer or new items instead, and eventually they wanted electronics gaming systems, for the Nintendo systems were hot items during those times, and we were not receiving any of those. Moreover, in relation to the clothing or textiles plastic recycling efforts that Head Start Recycles was conducting, as time went along, China started restricting greater and greater amounts of recyclable plastics from coming into their country, mostly because of the manners in which those were being sorted in the greater North America market before being sent to them. For waste items, such as dirty disposable plastic diapers and so much more, were being mixed with these textile plastics. Anyways, there's truly a whole lot more to it than even those things mentioned that I'll not get into about all those negative facts, for I don't want to take away from anyone else's possible future actions in those types of endeavors. But I will say this to anyone that wants to attempt these types of mostly positive actions. Just watch yourselves and make certain of everyone else's actions within your justifiable goals and not-for-profit organizations. And stay vigilant and observant, for there are those types of peoples out there that will use any opportunity to advance their personal interest and even steal money from places that are not watching or very careful. Now, with all that said, I'll leave off at this point for now. Please join me for the next and final video of this interesting series of the rise of the eco-guards. Stand on guard with me, the Call to Serve Canada series, entitled Part 2, Section J, Computational Determinations.